So yeah, welcome. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime at the webinar that seeks to answer some questions around vision-led transport planning. My name is Katja Stille. I'm an executive member and past chair of the Urban Design Group, as well as director at Tibbalds. And I will introduce the speakers and kind of pick out the questions and manage the questions. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available via Urban Now's and the UDG website in a couple of weeks' time. So hopefully that's okay with everyone. I think we all know how it works now. Keep yourself muted, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as we go along. I propose that we first hear all the speakers and then have a Q&A at the end. If anything particular comes up, I might kind of ask a question a bit earlier on. I think just to set the scene a bit, and everybody in this room will know what we are going to talk about. The way we plan our transport and movement networks is clearly critical to achieving the place and health outcomes that we want to achieve, and to kind of create better lives for and healthier lives for our communities. There has been a long tradition that for some reason every new neighborhood has to have at least one, if not several, large roundabouts at the gateway and the entrance. And you sometimes wonder how we ended up with that. Residents have been kind of locked into car-dependent lifestyles because we have been focusing on vehicle travel. And that has really dominated the discussion above public transport, walking and cycling. Sometimes working in the kind of the current or maybe the old system and processes, it feels a bit like we are taken hostage by transport assessments, modeling, and outdated assumptions that generate trips and lead to more car ownership. And too often we come across where it seems to be the computer dictates what we do and what we don't do. It has put us in a situation where we are setting aside huge amounts of money for large roads that may not be required or be desired. And personally, I've been in rooms with developers, local authorities, and highway consultants where everybody agreed that a specific large new piece of vehicular infrastructure or junction was undesirable. Nobody wanted it, and the money could be spent for better things. However, when the transport assessments were submitted, the planning applications approved, the Section 106 signed, there was a road and money was ring-fenced for it. So how can we get out of that situation? And for years, people have been talking about a vision-led approach, vision and validate, all those different terms. And it's, to be honest, for a non-highway person, can be quite confusing. The vision-led approach has been endorsed by National Highways, DFT, so hopefully we don't have to talk about justifying that approach any longer, but we can actually get on and kind of figure out what it means in our day-to-day work and how we can refocus the approach around people, everyday trips, and national policy goals such as carbon reduction, health and well-being, and quality of life. So today, I think is really about getting some clarity. How does it work? I mean, I'm sure there's still a lot of questions, and I think everybody is maybe feeling their way a bit. How does it work from kind of site allocation all the way into the legal agreements? And I'm particularly interested also in how non-highway engineers, urban designers, planners, councillors, members, the communities, how are they able to contribute the process and understand those processes? Because they need to ask the right questions, and they need to hold highway authorities or consultants to account that might not be adopting this approach. So with all these different terms being thrown around, like I said, I'm a bit confused by it, and I hope that really our speakers will provide clarity for the whole of the audience of what we need to expect, what questions to ask, and how we can go forward to a vision-led future. So please add your questions in the chat, and I think we will just start straight off. Our first speaker is David Milner, Managing Director from Create Streets, and they recently published an excellent report on the subject, Road to Nowhere. It shows the benefits of an alternative approach of transport planning, and if you haven't read it yet, do pick it up. It's a really good read and really helpful. So David, over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Lots of familiar faces as well. So I think we can get into quite a fun discussion today. I should say as well, thank you to Sustrans, who we did the work with as well, and Transport for New Homes, who helped in some of the workshop phases. So I think I've got sort of 15, 20 minutes. I'll try and keep it there on the side of being a bit shorter to talk through, I think, what hopefully is quite a tangible project that will put kind of bring this to life and kind of bring it hopefully moving away from lots of the terminology and into, okay, what does this look like on a master plan and on a big new development? And the one we picked was in Chippenham. Just kind of, before I share my slides and sort of dive into it, I got very interested in this. I think it was around about kind of 3 or 4 years ago when we were master planning a site. This one Create Streets was doing down in the southwest, Devon area. And we had a really good developer, quite forward thinking, looking at increasing, creating what we refer to as gentle density on the edge of a town. We're looking at sort of doing an e-bike loan scheme. We'd wanted to put a pub co-working space, which sounds pretty cool, into the site, a nursery and a little shop, with the idea that actually we can sort of tweak down some of the parking numbers to give us the space for more homes and parks. And that we can actually fund some of this, what I call social infrastructure, within the site itself, and that it's not a place where every single person is going to have 2.5 cars. Potentially, might be 1.5 over the whole site. And then we got, we produced this nice master plan, and then unfortunately sort of heard back from the transport team that, oh, you can't do this in phase 1. You can't put in the pub. You can't put in the nursery and the shop. Because you're going to break this roundabout. And I got kind of very interested by that phrase of break this roundabout and what does that mean, and why are you saying this? And they essentially sent across a big PDF transport model known as Predict and Provide, but a big PDF transport model which had all the different roundabouts, and the town was sort of cut into roundabouts and nodes and linkages, with numbers basically saying at this roundabout you're going to get 170 trips to the left, 200 straight on, about 60 to the right. And I kind of looked in the top right corner and realized it said 2035. And as I studied engineering, as someone who I think is like an okay-ish grasp of numbers, this just seemed mad that we were predicting down to one significant figure the number of vehicle trips that were going to be in 15 years' time, when I think if you kind of were doing projections pre-pandemic, all these things have kind of gone out the window. And when I sort of pushed back and said, "Oh no, it's fine. We've got an e-bike, we've got the pub. We're going to internalize the trips," which is a phrase you might hear, which basically just means actually more. You can kind of live a little bit more of your day within the development if you want to, because there's interesting things to visit here. And we're going to kind of support crossing the road. Basically putting a nice crossing and some protected bike lanes. And essentially came back with a computer says, no, we can't do this because we're taking historic trip datas, and that's what we need to use in this area to essentially get this through planning. So I think when I heard that, I thought, okay, this is a really big issue, and I want to kind of dive into it. So that led me to producing this report, which you sort of referred to, Katja, Computer Says Road, which dug into the why of this and how we might go about changing it, which is all sort of well and good. But I think what really we wanted to, and what people would benefit from, is seeing what does this look like in practice. So we're very kindly supported to produce Stepping Off the Road to Nowhere, looking at a real site and saying this is what it looks like with Predict and Provide in terms of land take, in terms of the urban form, the infrastructure, the transport, all the kind of mixed, everything that's non-residential. But what would it look like if we took a vision-led approach? And that is what people refer to as vision and validate, design and provide. And this is a story basically. So chose Chippenham because it was what we believe was really quite a poor plan. And it was a big 75 million funded road as well. Looking at transport modelling, and you kind of set the scene, so I might slightly skip over this, but clearly a lot of the developments and urban extensions are predicated on sort of big road infrastructure, and that is a solution that does, we can build them and people can move around. There are lots of negative outcomes you get from that, and also it's quite a blunt instrument. I sort of refer to it as, the kind of the sledgehammer. You've got 75 million quid to build your development and then allow people to move around. That is one way of doing it, but it's sort of quite a limiting way of doing this. And we know that it's bad for the environment, bad for people and local economies and agglomeration of those towns. And we keep getting places like this. I'm sure a lot of people on the call know some of the problems. If you do just have a road-led infrastructure, clearly climate change and air pollution goes without saying. I think the biggest one for me was just the cost of this. I kind of picked out the 27 billion roads budget. That's just one budget. There's lots of other stuff. There's devolved administrations. There's roads is the second biggest cost for all local authorities. It comes in just behind housing and supporting housing. So roads and transport is an absolute massive local cost as well, let alone the kind of revenue cost and the maintenance cost that when you build these new bits of infrastructure they require. They really lead to very low density plans. So we're going to need more and more land when we don't necessarily have as much of it. And they can exacerbate inequality. Building more roads, as we looked at with Computers Road, actually leads to more congestion because you sort of lock more people into those lifestyles, and you kind of there's a lot of latent demand which you then unleash. And then clearly with low density, you kind of get into this spiral of low viability of public transport because you just don't have enough people per square kilometre or per hectare to actually support good mass transit. And then places are unpopular, and I think everyone's probably seen the Appleyard diagrams of leading to social exclusion. In a nutshell, predict and provide. Hopefully, you can see the sort of. I've tried to kind of narrow this down to a really simple flowchart. You describe existing car travel. You forecast the population growth in that area. You forecast for future car travel increase, which does tend to be the DfT forecast you see as GDP goes up. You're forecasting for more and more people to own cars. You describe the existing network conditions and then actually often tend to forecast for really bad network conditions as well. So you're sort of, you've got the fire, the floods, everything kind of combining at once, and you're trying to provide the solution that can serve all of those things. Once you've forecasted all of these, you develop the proposals and then recommend investment. I think an interesting thing is actually predict and provide was coined as a bit of a critique for this form of transport planning. It seems to be taken on by some of the modelers themselves. The problem is we're really bad at forecasts. This is the DfT's own graph. You've got the kind of black worm, which basically shows flatlining actual growth in car traffic, and then all the predictions going right back to the 80s, showing nice linear regression lines going up and up and up. So clearly, we're just not very good at this forecasting, especially looking out 15 years ahead. So coming to Chippenham, this was the original plan. You can maybe just see my cursor. The kind of teal blob was the outline development area. This was a bit of parkland and some other developments. And then you've got 3 road options, which, when you look at these, can only be described as quite a fast road, ring road essentially, which is going through the middle of the development, which is never the most sensible idea, and it's not really what you describe as a bypass. There was 75 million quid from the Home Housing Infrastructure Fund. And we thought that Chippenham would be a good example to look at how could we show a different way of providing the same number of homes, potentially on less land, and fund the infrastructure and allow people to move around in sort of, give them more choice basically for their movement. So we took the number of homes, and we took this and looked at one approach on the left-hand side, predict and provide, and then what a vision validator or a vision-led approach would lead to on the right. So we split this into, sorry, not the most visual slide, but we split this into a series of big moves, and doing this with Sustrans, Transport for New Homes, went and visited Chippenham and spoke to a few of the local campaigners groups and local politicians. And we identified about 10 moves here. So one is intensifying the master plan for gentle density, so essentially putting it on less land. Looking at brownfield infill, looking at rail, improving streets within the new developments. That's actually still spending on bits of highways. We acknowledge that we were still going to need to spend a bit of money on the junctions and maybe on some of the kind of primary streets which would be within your network. Looking at car clubs, looking at buses, A key one, move 7, which I'll come on to in more detail, which is supporting local businesses within the site, then improving the town and actually contributing to the town centre just outside the red line and outside the site. Because if you are going to grow Chippenham by about 50% of the population, which this could have done over fair enough, over quite a few years, it's right that this should contribute to making this a better town, a more beautiful town, a more prosperous town. And then a big chunk on cycle links as well. And then we actually sort of had a bit of money left over because we couldn't spend it all. So there's an argument here for either contingency and inflation, which we sort of then found was the case, or actually that this could be a cost-saving measure as well. So move 1. This is the kind of the big move, and probably where this for me morphs from being a project just talking about transport modelling and planning through to actually talking about how do we grow new towns, how do we solve this question of a massive housing crisis and the 1.5 million homes that we're short of in the UK at the moment. So we reduced the land take from 350 hectares to 120 for 7,500 homes. We put a cost to this one at 0. The reality is, if you were obviously going to be purchasing this land, this can have a negative cost. This could really be quite a cost-saving measure for depending on the economics of this development. We looked at the reason we went to hopefully you can see the yellow block pattern. That's our approach, and the red is the existing. And I think it's quite a striking graphic that has had quite a lot of impact. The town centre and the train station is just off to where my cursor is now. So we put it here for proximity. There's going to be more people with a quicker walk or a quicker cycle into the station. There were already 2 lovely protected cycle links that we could just tap into from this, and that was totally traffic free, and they'd take you right into the station or into the town. And the other big thing that this did was it actually gave existing residents, so all the people in the white blocks, you can see their access to nature is far increased by this plan, because it will take them fewer minutes to basically walk out to the countryside, whereas before with quite a sprawling plan, even if you do have parks, and people have heard sangs and all these different technical terms, which is often just open space, that's not countryside. That would still be sort of managed open space. So I think there's a real benefit that's overlooked often in maintaining existing populations' access to the countryside. You can see some of the plan here is much more emulating the centre of Chippenham. In fact, the density itself was really not that crazy. It's not that high, 58 homes per hectare. It's not an astonishing number. You can do this really easily with terraced housing. You can do this with some mansion blocks. You do need to take on and reduce some of the parking, and we did. But then we're obviously funding other ways of people getting around to do that. We still had spaces for every home if needed. And then we also looked at mirroring the existing densities within Chippenham itself, and then moving this to create a sort of low and mid-rise housing to connect to the existing town. Very keen on leaning into the visuals to show what this could look like, and that by working with some of the local groups, we could show places that actually felt this reflects Chippenham. This is a place that I'd want to live in. And don't be alarmed, we're not talking about just stacking lots of towers onto the edge of Chippenham. And this is not going to be some necessarily changing the character of Chippenham. It's reflecting Chippenham itself. Big move 2 is infilling unused brownfield lands. So actually not looking at within our site, but we thought if you're going to be trying to solve the number of homes and trying to contribute to the number of homes with infrastructure fund, why not top up the brownfield fund, which is about 3,500 per home, if I remember, from the government to build more housing on old car parks and on disused, big box land or whatever it might be. So let's top that up a little bit, and this can help to deliver some of the homes. Big move 3 was looking at the rail connections between Chippenham itself, Melksham to the south, Trowbridge you've got as well, Swindon up to the north. One of the benefits and curses of this area is you've got the Western Main Line that goes, GGR goes right the way through and connects up to Bath. But that's a really fast train, which means that you struggle to fit in the kind of more local connecting trains, the town-to-town trains in between. So sometimes you could be waiting for an hour to an hour and a half to just go south. So no one's really going to viably commute by rail because you don't have the public transport here to do it. Well, actually, why don't we fund a passing loop, which is essentially a lay-by, so the train can stop and you can get some more local services in the meantime. and that will actually help to lower the background congestion and lower the overall traffic congestion in the whole town, and is a boon to people that might want to move to Chippenham and work in Melksham, but and move to this new development and be able to sort of get the train instead of driving. Big move 4, improving the streets of the new developments. That's actually just funding highways, but that's gone down from 75 million to 10 million, because we're not relying on a big connecting loop road, as you saw from the master plan. Number 5 was we basically spoke to officers and said, what would you do with buses? And they pulled out a lovely gold-plated bus plan that they'd done from a few years ago. And we said, okay, well, let's fund the capital costs of this of 1.5 million, and give it 5 years revenue whilst this development would be built out. And then it's going to increase your patronage and make this actually more viable in the long run. So we could have a really good bus for our site, but also that helps to support the wider site. Lots of money for car clubs, mobility hubs. The idea that your second or your third car, instead of it being sitting around empty most of the time, actually you could use a car club. You could get the right vehicle for when you need it, get a van when you need it, get a small car, get a long range, get an electric car, whatever your needs will be. We've got loads and loads of car clubs here available. Number 7, I think this is a really interesting big one. Is it takes a long time for development to be built out. So in the first few years, the most viable place to put your centre and your businesses tends to be next to the existing flow of traffic. And we've seen this in a few sites, and again led by modelling, that you put your local centre next to the busy road, so you get the passing trade until your development gets off the ground. Problem is when you've then built out your whole development, you've got potentially the centre right at the edge. So what we wanted to do, which is something they did in Poundbury as well, is support, through very low rents, through low costs, low business rates, support those shops and services for the first kind of like 5-10 years, so that they're in the geographically most sensible place, i.e. in the centre of development, or sort of wherever the kind of centre of mass for people is. So we put some money towards that. And then £10 million for shop fronts, for the public realm, for the actual high street itself. And this is to encourage more people to walk and cycle to the local high street rather than driving 20 out of town retail parks. And then we've got the big move, which was obviously driven a lot by Sustrans and ourselves, is creating a really good cycle network for about £15 million, which is actually can do a huge amount of good within the site itself. You can build these into the actual development cost, so it's not a huge cost, but obviously retrofitting some of the existing streets, and you can see the sort of coloured dots on the bottom left diagram, which shows the different network we're creating. This is where a really exciting bit came in, and massive thanks to Nicola and her team who are on the call, and we'll sort of talk about modelling in a bit more detail. We basically took it over to modellers and we said, right, let's validate this. Let's put this through a model to see if we take these moves, if we dial this up to 10, if we dial this up to 6 or 7, how is this actually going to influence the traffic levels and how many people might be driving around our development? I'm not going to pause on this for too long and let you read all the detail, but I'm very happy to share slides, and this is all in the report, so you can see this. But we assessed based on all these different big moves and against the public transport levels, the walking levels, the demand management levels. So how much actually are you sort of trying to reduce car journeys, and then placemaking and planning, so making a nice place. Which of our moves will move the needle or not? Yellow being sort of a medium impact, green is major, and red is minor. And this led us to some pretty staggering findings, quite impressive findings, and hopefully some stuff that does make us think twice. So probably the most exciting the most exciting number here for urbanists might be the top right, which is a mode share drop in car use from 72% to 46%, which is a massive shift. It's still actually a little bit short of the TCPA's target of 40% car use for garden communities, but that's by virtue of we weren't making any massive moves in terms of building a massive job centre or a massive kind of power plant or whatever it might be right on Chippenham's doorstep, which is going to totally change the movement patterns. So a lot of people from Chippenham do move outside of Chippenham, and we weren't building a new railway line for the entirety of Wiltshire. So that led to 12,000 fewer car trips a day, 9,300 more people walking and cycling every day. a decrease in the background traffic. We were pretty conservative on this one. We sort of modelled around about 5%. We think it could go higher. I actually think it could be even bigger than this if you sort of set the town on a new direction of transport investment. And clearly this is going to lead to 2,000 tonnes fewer carbon emissions. That's a massive chunk, if not the entirety of most local authorities' kind of targets for saving carbon, and 3,000 more public transport users every day. I think these are two lovely graphics that were done by the team as well, looking at what does vision validate or vision led or decide and provide mean versus the way we're doing it at the moment. And the development on the right, this sort of pattern of big distributor road, collector road, roundabout led, with parcels that are sort of hived off on those roundabouts with the flags with the house builder you always see, through to actually the white blocks here being the extension, the kind of organic extension of a town that actually you do need to fundamentally change the approach to transport planning and transport assessments to do this. And I can pause there. I'll flash up that this is not just us saying, hey, here's a nice approach, we'd love this all to be done this way. We really dug into the detail in, okay, what are the mechanisms? What do national bodies need to do? What does DfT, DLUC, Homes England, Travel England, what can they all do to sort of get us here? And there's not going to be one silver bullet. It's going to require lots of different interventions and lots of different alignments of incentives and policy changes through everything from the NPPF to Traffic Management Act to Highways Acts to NMDPs. But if you're interested and you want to get into how can we actually sort of change this at a local level, there's a few recommendations here for you. Probably the big one I'd draw your eyes to is maybe number one, which is looking at transport assessments. And essentially, one of the most successful things we've seen, I'll stop sharing now, is when local authorities adopt policies for decide and provide or for vision and validate, such as we've seen in Oxfordshire, because that then has a cascading effect to put pressure on every developer, every sense that you can essentially use a decide and provide method. You don't have to be beholden to some traffic forecasting figures, taken from data from 30, 40 years ago. You can do this a different way. And what we found is there are developers out there that are really crying up to do this. They don't always want to produce, build 2.7 parking spaces per dwellings. They'd rather build more homes, which is understandable. And they'd rather build more parks or build more sort of, beautiful places to give value to themselves. So you should find some allies there. But I think it does start with the local authorities setting out the requirements to do this. And I think Somerset as well have adopted some really interesting highways principles recently, which might be starting to have an effect on some big sites there. Right, I've gone over my 20, so I'll pause there, Katja, but happy to do questions later on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. It set us off really with kind of like absolute practical examples. And I mean, every time I see, the figures as well, the financial arguments, I mean, it should be a no-brainer, shouldn't it? I mean, houses are unaffordable at the moment. We had years of austerity and no public services, and there's a lot of money going into things that maybe actually not that many people want or desire. So I think really government needs to kind of think about also the different funding pots in the departments, aligning them. But I think that's not a new message. I think you've heard us, the UDG, saying that many times, that there needs to be a bit more alignment on the national level as well as the local to make this work and kind of get the benefits. So our next speaker is Amy Beasley from National Highways. So dealing with the other, kind of bigger scale of development and road infrastructure, and really interesting to hear how, National Highways, whose remit is maintaining the highways of our country, and how you have adopted the vision-led approach. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, and hopefully some slides have magically appeared. So my name's Amy Beasley. I'm the Senior Economic Development and Spatial Planning Manager at National Highways. I will just flag now, I have some small children with me, so I'm having some flashbacks to the first COVID lockdown. And if I do have any glamorous assistants joining me on the call, I do apologise in advance. So what I wanted to share today was a little bit of context and perspective from National Highways around the shift to vision-led planning, a little bit on how we're trying to help deliver vision-led planning in practice, and then just some thoughts, hopefully to prompt some discussion later on around what we can all collectively do to try and fully embed vision-led planning in our practice. So just by way of brief background, so as Katja said, National Highways are responsible for operating, maintaining the strategic road network. So that's 4,500 miles of motorway and major A road across England. To put a little bit more kind of figures behind that, so that network accounts for 95 billion miles every year. We're carrying 3 times as many people as the rail network. 34% of all traffic, and I think most significantly, nearly 3/4 of all freight movements. And relevant to this discussion today, as a statutory consultee in the planning system, we receive around 3,500 planning applications every year, and that number's been fairly stable for a number of years now. So we are, as I say, a statutory planning consultee. We do have a high number of applications that come in to our regional teams across the country. These range from individual householder applications through to major energy, major rail and major airport schemes. And as well, we have a slightly unique view as a statutory consultee because we are an applicant as well. We apply for planning permission for our own schemes. So we see the system and the planning process from both sides. So just in terms of vision-led planning, you know, not as Katja said, we're not at the stage of needing to justify taking this approach and kind of try and explain why it's a good thing, but it has been set out really clearly within the Department for Transport Circular 01/2022. And if you haven't yet read that document, I've included the link in the slides there. But that's the document that we use as National Highways when we're assessing planning applications, and it sets out very clearly that we have a role in that push towards decarbonising transport, and it really closely aligns with the MPPF around making sure that we're getting the right development in the right places when we are looking at planning applications and local plans. So what it does say is that we will be moving away, or we are moving away from predict and provide, and instead we are trying to work with communities, particularly via local planning authorities, to set out a vision or an outcome that they want for their local areas, and then identifying the transport solutions that are needed to deliver those. So I think it's safe to say, you know, shift to vision-led planning is quite tricky. Fundamentally, it means we need to be having a different discussion with developers, a different discussion with local authorities, and not starting with the modelling straight away, which perhaps is a kind of a comfortable place to start. So as National Highways, we know that we need to be looking strategically at a national level. We are a national organisation, but we also need to recognise and support and reflect those regional and local strategies and visions as well. So unfortunately, I haven't got all the answers today for vision-led planning, but what I want to share with you now is a couple of tools that we are using at National Highways to try and set out our vision for the strategic road network, recognising that it is only one part of the kind of bigger infrastructure picture, but hopefully using those tools to help support others in identifying what their visions are and what we want planning and development to achieve. So starting out, we have a series of strategy documents that look right out from long term. The one on the left-hand side there, Connecting the Country, that sets out our long-term vision for the strategic road network out to 2050. And it recognises that the future is uncertain, and therefore our approach needs to reflect that. That document then is underpinned by the documents that form part of the road investment strategy, so reflecting the fact that our funding from the Department for Transport comes in 5-year blocks. So we are at the very end now of road investment strategy 2, which takes us up to 2025, and we'll shortly be publishing road investment strategy 3. And then underneath those 5-year delivery plans, we have annual delivery plans as well, which set out what we will be doing as an organisation to deliver that vision in a single financial year. So those documents are all available and hopefully help set out what we think the challenges and opportunities are for our network and how it integrates with others as well. Supporting Connecting the Country, we have our route strategies. And again, I've included the link here if you haven't seen those documents before, but they're a really important part of our research and evidence base. So these are splitting our strategic road network into 20 key routes. and looking at a route basis on how does the network operate across that route, what's its function, how is that changing, how does it interact with other networks and local development, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and where are those potential areas where we need further investigation, where we think there might need to be future investment potentially. So again, those are really useful documents, we hope, that help set out some of our data and intelligence and our understanding of our network and how it works and how it's going to change. Again, so that can support others in identifying how development may or may not need to interact with that network. I will say they are available on the website at the moment. There will be a refresh coming out later in the year with hopefully a bit more interactive, more data for you to be able to interrogate yourselves as well. And as well as the route strategies, just the final tool I wanted to share that we have. And again, if you haven't seen this before, the link is there for you. This is our planning guide, so planning for the future. We relaunched this at the back end of last year to set out how it is that we want or should interact with the planning system. So how we will engage with others, both in relation to planning applications and obviously local plans as well. And that document starts to articulate our broad approach to vision-led planning, particularly flagging how we are seeking to monitor and manage. So how we understand what's happening in practice with some of these developments and how do we manage if that vision it maybe isn't being achieved as we expected. So what that document does is set out really that we want to be proactive in the planning system. We want to be a proactive planning partner. Our absolute priority is to understand the impact on the strategic road network, particularly in terms of the impact on safety. But we also want to know how we can make most of the opportunities around our routes and how we can best support new development. So I would, if you haven't seen that document before, would encourage you to do so. So just to finish off, a couple of thoughts around vision-led planning and how we collectively can embed it in practice. So certainly as National Highways, we can't do it on our own. So we have a very strong policy footing for this, but we can't do it by ourselves. So we know, and we already are working really closely with local authorities across the network. We've had some really good recent discussions with Active Travel England, and really pleased to see Jon from Homes England on the call today as well. So we want to work and continue to work with those partners to understand where are there good examples of vision-led planning and how is it working and how can we support that. And I know Oxfordshire's already been mentioned this afternoon as a good example. We're looking across our network at some local authorities that are really working hard on this agenda and how we can support them. We also recognise that we can't look at our network in isolation. So again, previous presentation mentioned around opportunities for rail and how it is that we shift movements onto the rail network. So we're already working really closely with Network Rail to look at opportunities for how we can jointly plan in the long term for some of our investments, really to try and embed that modal shift as early on in the process, in the strategy setting process as possible. On that similar vein, we can't do vision-led planning retrospectively. So as I said, in our planning guide, we're really clear that we want to be involved as early as possible via pre-app and early discussions in relation to planning applications. But we're also really trying to strengthen our relationships with local planning authorities to support them with their local plan making so that we are influencing and able to support at the earliest stage. We recognise where we have situations where there aren't up-to-date local plans in place, we're getting more speculative applications in, and vision-led planning is really hard with speculative applications. So certainly continuing to work with local authorities on local plans. And again, just to reflect some of the comments that have been made already, we are working very closely with the Department for Transport because we feel there really needs to be some further guidance on vision-led planning. But as well as that, we also need the updated transport assessment guidance and making sure that is supporting the shift to vision-led planning as well. So I will pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's really good to see that, that approach is being adopted at a very strategic level. So that kind of then also helps kind of filtering it down. And I think really good point that, no agency, no organization, no person can do it alone. It's a partnership that needs to develop between everyone. And that collection of case studies and learning, that came up the other day in a different meeting. And maybe, you know, all of you, if you know about good examples, put them in the chat so we can share of some of that learning where either local plans, local authorities are adopting that approach or have resolved some of the challenges. And not wanting to put Robert Haxford on the spot, but maybe we can then kind of feed them out again to a wider audience via the next urban update or something. So it would be really good to gather some of the examples so we can share the learning across a kind of wider group of people. So next on is Nicola Lodge and Geoff Burrage from ITP. They already had a prompt from David. So in this presentation today, they will do a double act and explain how vision-led planning works in practice from site allocation, policy to Section 106 agreements and delivery. So no easy task. Over to you, Nicola and Geoff.
I'll share my screen, Geoff, and then if you want to prompt me when you'd like me to move on.
Right, yeah.
Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, we can. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, and thanks, Katja, for the introduction. So yeah, let's move next slide. So my name is Geoff Burrage. I'm an Associate Director, Integrated Transport Planning, and Nicola Lodge will also be helping with or giving us half a presentation as well. So we've done a lot of work and thinking on vision-led transport planning over the last few years, and we've begun to embed that into a series of tools. There's been a lot of talk about tools so far already, one of which actually David referred to in the Create Streets work. Our mode shift model was part of how we got the numbers out of all the great stuff that David and Sustrans were doing in terms of the interventions there. And we've been applying this research-led, evidence-led approach to vision-led planning into various strategic schemes across the country. Hertfordshire, Essex, Leeds and Lancaster are some of the recent examples. So let's next slide, please. So I think the first message is, yeah, we just need to cheer up a bit, be more positive. I think this is, if we move on to the next slide, this is really important, I think, because it strikes me that one of the biggest challenges we've got really is people. It's not really the process. We did some work for the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport, and they're better, I always get this wrong around, better places, better transport. Better planning, better transport, better places. There we go. I did get it the wrong way around. And what we found there was that actually a big barrier is that a lot of people just don't believe you can do things differently. And that we see that all the time. Our transport planning colleagues, clients, councillors. Yeah, perhaps it's kind of a sense of the wider kind of national picture at the moment, and general kind of wariness. But yeah, people don't believe things can change, but people do want things to be better. We've also done work working with communities and the Royal College of Art, so not transport focused necessarily about what people wanted or didn't want in their towns. We've got some Biggleswade examples on the slide there. People don't want more cars. They want to be able to walk places. They want, you know, social spaces, green spaces, more planting, that sort of thing. So I think we need to work on people. Would be one of the messages. I think we need to, you know, challenge colleagues where we think they're not going down the right line. We need to kind of work with and educate our politicians where we can. I think we need to highlight perhaps uncomfortable inconsistencies as well. You know, most local authorities have declared a climate emergency. A lot of them have net zero ambitions for the late 2030s. Well, how are you going to do that if you're not making pretty radical changes right now? You can't just flick a switch in 2037 and expect things to change. So, you know, highlighting these challenges doesn't necessarily make the most popular person in the room, but I think they're really important things to do. But through that, you know, we've got to remember this is about achieving a vision we want to see. So it's a positive thing. We need to stay positive. But the problem as well is David and others have referred to the very precise outputs of modeling, and people find that reassuring. It's also potentially a way of avoiding personal responsibility, just to put numbers into a model and get very precise, often precisely wrong numbers out at the other end. One of the challenges with a vision-led approach is that you need often a leap of faith, because there aren't many precedents to point to, and that's, again, goes all the way back to that problem we often have sitting around a table in a project. Well, what are the examples? How are you going to do it differently? That is often what leads people to end up kind of doing more of the same. So I'll talk a very little bit about predicting and providing. Predict and provide. David's obviously done quite a lot of the legwork on this one already, so I don't need to cover too much of the ground. But I think the issue is we're sort of trying to, we're focusing on the wrong problems obsessively, I think. We focus on delay, we focus on congestion, and that often is really the only metric that people are thinking about, and delay and congestion obviously only for private vehicles as well. And then that leads us to the inevitability of looking at using the wrong tools. So a strategic model will tell us this congestion is a problem right now. We can see that already. It'll be even worse if you add more cars to the mix, obviously, and then you get to the wrong conclusions. And I think, just thinking about, well, what are the how do we spot this? I think that was kind of one of the things I was thinking about this webinar is, what can we all do to sort of see when this is happening? Because people will often talk about vision-led, but they'll kind of lean towards the same kind of approaches. So in planning terms, it often means, a fixed level of growth in a fixed location. That's your starting point. Not thinking about transport to help you decide where places, where growth should be. That's the first problem. But then leaning straight on a model to kind of as a big part of your evidence base, identifying the highway pinch points and then the highway capacity you need to fix those pinch points. And I think often people will say it's vision-led if they've got nice vision and principles that then help mitigate the highway impact. So, more walking, cycling to help kind of reduce car trips at the margins. I think mitigate or mitigation is probably a word that we should ban altogether from the work we do. It shouldn't be about mitigating impacts. It should be about delivering a vision. But that kind of pattern is what you'll often see, even if it's badged as vision-led in a lot of projects. And it's good to spot that and then kind of gently begin to point out the path a project might be on. And then the next slide, I think, again, David touched on a lot of this, so I won't go into a lot of detail. The only thing I would say is if you build for the car, then inevitably that squeezes other things out financially as well as in terms of physical space. That kind of lack of choice is then mistaken for demand. So the model was right. We do need all this space for cars because all these cars are being generated, and then you get into a loop because that then gets plugged back into the model. That is then part of the evidence base for new developments elsewhere in the country. This is a sort of simple representation of what that might look like. I think on balance, that was a pretty negative, cynical start to our presentation. So maybe Nicola, you can cheer us up a bit more, even though I did say cheer up at the start, didn't I? And failed on my own count. But anyway.
Yeah, well, that was literally exactly what I was going to start with, which is Geoff has taken us all down the kind of bad cop, negative route there on predict and provide for a moment, but hopefully uplift us all again. So I'm going to be talking about what does vision-led planning look like in practice. And firstly, starting with a bit of demystifying about all the different terms that we're all throwing around today. My personal opinion is that they essentially all mean the exact same thing. So hopefully that makes people happy to hear. I'm firstly scaring you with all of the information on one slide. We might all have seen various versions of this. We might not even have seen these things. For all my sins, I spent some time doing a bit of a review, academia review, literature review of the academics out there that originally came up with these terms. So to give them a credit, there was Glenn Lyons, essentially, who came up with the term decide and provide, and that's what that flowchart is on the left. Then Peter Jones originally came up with vision and validate. That's what's seen on the right there. And I thought, so many people have asked me what's the difference between these things, and also what's monitor and manage, and how does that fit into it, and what's vision led. And I thought I'd just go away and find out for myself. I came up with these two flowcharts. They've been kind of at a high level stuck under the noses of Glenn and Peter, and they haven't disagreed with them. So these are good summaries of what each process means. And then in the middle there, I've just stuck vision-led, because to keep it kind of neutral and maybe a bit less confusing, that's the term that we, ITP, that I've landed upon, and also the one that DFT, and as we've heard, National Highways has also landed upon. So that's the complicated bit, but actually it can just be broken down, whichever phrase you use, whichever process you apply to transport planning, it can be broken down into probably 5 key stages. So firstly, it starts with defining a vision for a place. That vision might just be about transport, or it might go a little bit wider than that. What do we want a place to look like in terms of the people that live there? Are they happy? Are they active? Do they have access to jobs? It's then about understanding how transport relates to that vision. So some of those things directly relate to transport infrastructure and transport mode share. If we know the type of people that might use a service or want to access a service, then we know that we need to provide for them to get there. We would want to know how many people are going to be using that infrastructure, because then that helps us understand the capacity that you need on it. That all relates to things like air quality and carbon emissions, which then in turn comes back to health and well-being. The process then follows that you'd develop measures or transport interventions or ideas about infrastructure that would support that vision. Obviously, if we have a vision which starts with healthier lifestyles, more active lifestyles, genuine transport choice, then the infrastructure that we would naturally plan is going to be infrastructure which accommodates those journeys. It's going to be less car-based because we're placing less onus on the car. And so there's less car-based infrastructure and more infrastructure that supports sustainable trip making, walking, cycling, buses and trains and so on. There is then a stage that's testing the measures, and perhaps under a range of different scenarios. So certainly something that Glenn Lyons talks about is future uncertainty. We don't really know exactly how the future is going to look, so we need to plan a sort of range of scenarios, a fan of influence, and decide what infrastructure interventions might be best to accommodate that range of scenarios. There are lots of different ways you could test it, and certainly transport modelling still comes into play. There's a place for it here. It's just that we might place less emphasis on it and less onus on it, and also think about some qualitative measures and some multi-criteria assessment that help you test the impacts of infrastructure. Then the next stage is to deliver the preferred strategy. So those previous stages, you might have iterated with the testing and understanding whether you're achieving a vision. Once you've decided upon the preferred solution, then deliver it. And because it's one where we have set out to achieve a vision and we've set out to give people genuine transport choice, it's likely that strategy involves lesser highway-based mitigation and more schemes or kind of interventions that support active and sustainable trip making. And then the final stage in either process is around monitoring and evaluating success, and also thinking back to what Geoff was saying, thinking about alternative metrics of success. So if we focus solely on how much highway delay there will be, then we'll collect that data and we'll become obsessive about it effectively. There are other metrics of success that we could bring into this process. So how many more kilometres of cycleways are delivered? How many more people are walking? Are people walking more often? Is there or are there fewer emissions as a result of the strategy? So that's the process in a nutshell to me. And when you look at it like that, it isn't quite so complicated. And indeed, maybe there are fewer steps than what we see in some of our transport assessments at the moment. And then the next couple of slides effectively mirror what Geoff showed us about predicting providing, but instead, what does this look like in a vision-led world? So firstly, the same people are going to be making trips, probably the same number of people are going to be making trips, but there's more choice about how they can make them. And I've chosen my words carefully there. So there's genuine transport choice. It's not a war on the motorist. It's not about saying that people can't access cars, own cars, use cars, but they just have more choice. Instead of 70% of space being given over to driving, maybe 50%, 30% of space is given over to driving, and instead people can travel by other modes that are just as affordable and just as resilient and reliable. There's also similar tools in a vision-led process. It's just there's different emphases. I had to Google that one this morning. There's still a place for transport modelling. There's probably improvements we can make to it. It should be more multimodal. You should be able to vary the demand that gets fed into that model and how it thinks about the costs of travel and that sort of thing. But ultimately, there's still going to be residual vehicle-based impacts, and we were going to want to know whether they have, as Amy said, safety impacts, for example, on the strategic road network, and whether there's any kind of insurmountable or unacceptable congestion. But alongside that, there's definitely a place in sort of emerging transport assessment guidance for multi-criteria assessment and more qualitative assessment. As David said, we don't really need to know, we probably can't know whether there's 276 vehicles turning left at a roundabout, but we do know that that roundabout's probably going to be congested, and maybe that's all we need to know to come up with a different strategy. And then finally, as we've already said, organisations like TRIX, who help transport planners come up with trip rates and vehicle generation numbers, they're releasing guidance which takes an alternative approach and encourages us to think differently about numbers and modelling. And then, as Katja said, this is maybe one of the harder questions to answer. What does it mean in monetary terms? Broadly speaking, and it's a bit simplified, we believe that a lot of this involves the same costs and the same amounts of money, but the focus of that money is different. If at the very beginning of a strategy, we know that we're going to be giving over more space to alternative modes of travel and less space to vehicles, and our assumptions and our modelling and our testing suggests that fewer people will therefore travel by car, we just reapportion the way in which we spend our money. We still need the capacity for all of those people to move around. But if you've got 1,000 people suddenly needing a cycleway, you spend your money on your cycleway rather than the 1,000 people that might have needed to go in their cars and travel through a junction and spending money on that. One thing to add on to the end of it is that often you can achieve this at kind of a lower cost per home. You can get more homes out of a site if you deliver gentle density, and if you kind of stop planning for a theoretical capacity of the highway network. We often say that a site can only accommodate so many homes because the transport networks around it will fall over. Well, if we weren't planning for congestion and reducing delay, then we might be able to squeeze more homes out of a site and still deliver really genuinely impactful infrastructure as a result. So just in planning terms, how does the process look? Well, as we said, it starts with needing to embed visions and outcomes, different outcomes in policies and standards. But what I should say is that at the moment, there's absolutely no planning policy that stops us from doing this. The National Planning Policy Framework doesn't say, please transport planners, undertake modelling and tell us what the delay is and tell us what the journey times are. It just doesn't really give enough weight to all of the other things you might want to think about. So right now, as one of Geoff's slides said in the title, like, we're the arbiters of change. We can start planning things differently and using different approaches. And that is still in alignment with policy. Planning inspectors would find it hard to refuse that sort of thing. And we've seen examples of where they've accepted alternative approaches. But if you do have good policy and standards in place, then that really sets the ball rolling for a better process overall. So the next stage is starting earlier and working to better together. As Amy said, that kind of has to begin with maybe even before local plan site allocation. In spatial strategies, are we putting sites in the right places? Because when a site comes to us at planning application stage in the wrong place, then it's much harder to deliver sustainable mobility outcomes. And then once you get into the transport planning part of it, planning around people first is probably the most important thing, rather than planning around cars first, as Geoff said, and only then consider the residual impacts that might come from the people that still do need to use their cars to make their trips. And then finally, fund the infrastructure, as I've said, where the capacity is needed, and everything should follow off the back of that. There's probably a final point after that, which is getting on board the right house builders and the right people to deliver these projects once they've got their planning permission. And then this is my final slide. Again, it mirrors what Geoff had, and in fact could look fairly similar, but it's slightly reordered and there's a slightly different focus on some of these. It's a nice virtuous cycle. So instead of planning places that are planned around the car and using a model to tell us those answers, instead plan around people and the vision and outcomes we want to achieve, not all of which are going to be directly related to transport. Space gets used for alternative things instead of car parking spaces and roads. And people use that space for traveling differently. We then don't have that sort of false demand that follows through into our models. And the models just tell us to invest in alternative modes of travel because those are the networks where we need more investment. That in turn helps us further develop our policies and standards, feeding back into that cycle so that the next site that comes along, we've evaluated what's gone well and we do better next time again. And that's it.
Thank you very much. And I think you have uplifted us again.
Great, that was the aim.
It's really, I like presentations where it's, it's looking forward, doing the good things, and really, good to hear that, as you say, or confirm that we can just do this. We don't have to wait for another permission. There's nothing stopping us doing this. It stands up when we kind of have appeals and inquiries. There is no stipulation that we have to have the modeling. So I think it's really kind of a positive note that, yeah, well, let's do it really, and let's start with the vision. And also kind of to give the UDG another a plug. Some people in the UDG have come together and actually written a note which should be published very soon, which is about good urban form. And that really links back to the point of we need to develop in the right places. So if a site is allocated in the wrong place, then if we have the right line, there's only so much you can do. So it really has to start from a very strategic point. So our last speaker will kind of draw on a lot of experience from a lot of different sites and a lot of conversations. Jon Sandford, Senior Manager at Homes England. Homes England have a large portfolio of sites and work across a lot of different areas, local authorities, counties, with a lot of different consultants. And he will explain a bit about the consultation and external stakeholder liaison process that they have engaged with, and also some of the emerging tools that can be used. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm now going to presenter mode, hopefully, so you can all see my slides.
We can.
Yep.
Yeah.
So thank you, Katja, for that introduction. I guess I'll be saying some of the things that others have said already, but from the perspective of Homes England, one of the country's biggest developers of housing, obviously, from the point of view of the government, though, we're about trying to deliver and facilitate the delivery of housing across the country. And we do that through channeling government funding, grant and loan funding, together with recycling receipts from land deals and then acquiring land. And also working with other landowner partners to deliver sites where there's joint ownership. So there's a lot of sites across the country that we deal with, and we do have a land hub where you can see all the sites that, if you Google it, I think it's firegov.uk, you can Google all the sites that we're dealing with. So that's quite accessible to everybody. We don't have an official policy on vision-led transport planning, but what we do have is we've been undertaking some consultations with our consultant panelists on what does this all mean, how do we do it, towards developing a new approach, a progressive approach, an enlightened approach as to how we progress transport planning, and I suppose ultimately moving towards transport assessments for our sites. So potentially it's a new, what good looks like a conversation that we've been having with our partners. And it is entirely aligned with government policy, with government agency policy, well, I should say government department policy, DLUC and DFT, and also with local sustainability policy at a local authority level, often where climate change emergency declarations have been made. And it does arguably put an onus on local authorities to change their approach towards which modes of transport are encouraged and emphasised. Arguably, it all started in 2021, the vision and validate or vision-led approach through referencing decarbonising transport, but others in the sector have been producing interesting documents that all play to this agenda. So, the TCPA's 20-minute neighbourhood document, for example, the RTPI, CIHT, a lot of documentation is out there to try and guide and steer people as to how this is all done, or should be done, or could be done. This is quite a handy diagram that we've come across, vision-led, bringing the terms together. So And in fact, this, as I understand it, originated with National Highways to start with. But basically, it's saying that, vision and validate, decide and provide, monitor and manage, you can put them in a sort of a linear sequence where at the top end, you find the vision for the place and validate that that vision is deliverable numerically and or in a physical sense. Out of that vision, you decide what you're going to provide and when, which can involve sort of backcasting from the vision back to the starting point and sort of decide the infrastructure investments that you'll make along the way to get to that vision. And then to monitor and manage how the operationalization of the site is playing out and introduce positive feedback loops to encourage the behaviors that you anticipated will actually arise. So that's quite a neat way of sort of bringing these competing terms together, I think. And there was a sort of parallel there with the diagram that Nicola showed. I think you could trace some of that thinking through into the nice, neat flowchart diagram that Nicola showed before. This is entirely aligned with our strategic plan that was produced last year, and we have a strong sustainability thread through the strategic plan for Homes England, although we don't have a lot of explicit reference to transport, but nevertheless, sustainability and the vision-led approach do align very closely. But also it's about producing places that are sustainable, that enable the well-being, the health outcomes of residents ultimately to be realised and enhanced. So in summary, what's it all about? As well, creating sustainable and active travel options for sites, a package of measures that have those sorts of things in emphasis, said towards making places sustainable and self-contained. I've come to the conclusion through our consultations that the triple access planning framework is quite a useful way of being able to group initiatives together that make for a vision-led approach. So yes, of course, it's about transport initiatives and interventions. Sometimes that can involve highway improvements because you do ultimately need roads. Cars aren't, they're completely, well, they're not a bad thing. People need cars and they produce a lot of good social good. But it's about a change in emphasis in transport investment, as I said before. But importantly, it's the transport cornerstone together and integrally linked with the spatial planning cornerstone. In other words, thinking about things like amenities on site, densification of sites, trying to enable the spatial planning outcome to be more self-contained so people can live and work locally. And the final cornerstone, there's not a lot of emphasis put on this really at the moment, but this idea of digital connectivity, or as we've been terming it, smart place planning for sites, applying smart city technology at the site scale to enable people to live and work locally. I wonder whether there's an environmental impact assessment parallel here, whereby you screen a site for the potential for a vision-led approach to be implemented, you scope out the aspects of it that can be implemented, and then you do that process of design and evaluation using a vision-led approach. And I say that because, unfortunately, the reality is that while we at Homes England float very often the idea of a vision-led approach, very often there are, ingrained attitudes towards the traditional predict and provide approach. And so, as a developer, there's a risk of abortive work launching into something that you haven't got buy-in with the decision makers and the stakeholders. So it's very important to scope out the early stage what's realistic and what you can bring people along with in terms of the approach that you're going to take. Part of it, I think, is appraising outcomes and options in a broader set of terms. So moving away from traditional net present value, green book type appraisal, also into a situation of emphasising health, social welfare, social well-being and carbon outcomes. Because arguably, if you portray options in that broader way, you'd make a different set of decisions, or you enable decision makers to endorse a different set of solutions for a site. I think also, though, at the heart of it is this issue of reframing our thinking about risk and what congestion means and the acceptability of congestion. So predict and provide, has a fixation arguably about the peak hours and making sure that all congestion affecting cars is ironed out. Arguably, you could say, well, actually, congestion can be a good thing if it arises because it encourages people to make different choices, to travel differently at different times of the day and using different modes. So being able to take a risk and embrace that those different outcomes is, I think, potentially important, and bringing, as I say, stakeholders along with that. And there are emerging planning appeal cases, one of which I'll talk about at Preston shortly, that are endorsing and supporting the momentum for change in terms of the way planning applications are progressed through the vision-led approach. The Hartford appeal to do with the development at Hartford was a formative one, where the inspector said it's not the purpose of the planning policy to prioritise and protect the convenience of the car commuter. So these sorts of decisions are coming through the planning inspectorate and giving strength to our elbow in this approach. A little bit more on the triple access system then, originated by Glenn Lyons and others at the University of the West of England. As I say, I think it's a useful framework. And this diagram is really making the point that when COVID happened, the digital connectivity piece became more important. We all started using Teams. Overnight, people stopped traveling to work, and business went on, and people were able to work and live differently. Why can that not continue? But it brought into emphasis, as I say, the digital connectivity and the alignment with smart cities and smart place thinking as well. But the fourth cornerstone or pillar is this idea of stakeholder engagement and buy-in. That's got to be fundamental, I think, to make this approach credible and to gather momentum and to work at the site scale in any planning situation. Further perspectives from within our own staff body, if you like, that, the degree, how you apply vision-led depends on the scale of the site that you're dealing with. Small sites, less opportunity. New communities, new freestanding places, much more opportunity for this approach. We're not necessarily saying there's going to be more fee available for this work to be done. It's more about working smarter, doing more with the same, potentially. I mentioned the idea of working with those that are aligned and willing to go along with a vision-led approach. Important to explore the potential for vision-led early on in the planning process, start to persuade, influence early and upstream in the planning process, at the policy stage, at the allocation stage, rather than just expecting to be able to superimpose this approach late on, just a few months away from submitting a planning application. There's work to do upstream to get people on board. Other developers can be allies and advocates, some more so than others. And our other sort of partner government agencies are involved in this process too. So the DFT, Active Travel England, and Amy's talked about the perspective from National Highways. David's made a very useful comparison in his, a very useful case in his report that he talks about showing, well, what could you have if you did a different approach? And I think that's a very important way, potentially, of trying to convince and persuade that a vision-led approach is the way to go. Arguably, it may involve doubling up on doing both a predict and provide analysis alongside a vision-led analysis. But if you're going to get the vision-led analysis adopted, it's just something that may have to be done to be able to show the comparison of what you could have one thing versus the other. But we are also mindful of the political dynamics of the issue of self-containment, 10, 15, 20-minute neighbourhoods and so on. So it's about portraying that issue in a sensitive way so as not to scare the horses, if you like. Various new approaches are out there and new tools that are out there to help us do this sort of work. Amongst our consultant panel, we've come across several on the left-hand side there. I won't go into them in detail, but on the right-hand side of that slide, there are existing tools that are available as well to help us analyze situations using a different perspective. So, for example, space syntax, UMove and place logic are all software that enables us to place an emphasis on the connectivity of the walking and the cycling network to emphasize those sorts of outcomes. We've sort of floated the idea with our consultants of developing a barometer tool, something that we can use with projects to ask the question, how are we doing against the different facets of the vision-led approach, be it transport, be it spatial planning, be it digital, be it stakeholder engagement and buy-in, and use that as a way of showing how the frontier of what we're doing expands, hopefully, as the project progresses, a bit akin to using the place standard, Scottish Government's place standard tool. That's just an idea, but I suppose a question for anybody out there, is there any mileage in developing that, and could it be made into something that's quite slick, a bit like the place standard tool? We've been talking to the DFT and they are supportive of what we've been doing. They see it as being, I think, useful to have this intellectual debate about the vision-led approach. The DFT welcomes collaboration with us and others on understanding what the vision-led approach means. It also gives strength to DFT in their conversations with government as to guidance that may be issued sometime in the future. And the DLUC are similarly interested and supportive. Where is this happening? Well, there are various project situations on a sort of a spectrum, I suppose. There are certain projects where we've been trying to initiate a vision-led approach explicitly, for example, at Long Marston, south of Stratford-on-Avon. There are projects that we're delivering where aspects of the vision-led approach are being delivered. So, for example, Burgess Hill, Northern Arc Burgess Hill, but also at North Stowe, arguably. There are projects where others have developed planning proposals explicitly on a vision-led basis. Silverstone Park is one that we're aware of, where a project was turned around from having to deliver a £75 million grade separated interchange into a much more modest, in financial terms, sustainable emphasis in the transport package that was delivered there. And we've also been doing some formative work in smart place planning on projects, where we recognise that the development of a site needs to have that component of digital connectivity and new technology in the built environment, in homes, in the cloud, and underground, and to the networks to enable a place to work in a modern and progressive way. Lastly, just to bring into focus the, you could say it's a landmark case, but Pickering's Farm, Preston, where we took this site through appeal in the face of a traditional desire to deliver a cross-borough link road. We put forward an alternative scenario based on a vision-led approach, which the inspector upheld. And so our appeal was successful, and arguably it does provide, further strength to successor companies, developers to go along this road as well. Some key lessons came out of that, 3 or 4 of them on the left-hand side there. So that vision-led is the right approach, and that predict and provide has less weight now. Prior congestion is not necessarily a good reason for refusal, making links to the Hertford appeal case that I mentioned before. But also to appreciate the nuances of traffic modelling when models are shown to be at congested conditions. You have to be more sophisticated in the conversations that you have then about, well, what does that mean? Will in fact people make behave differently and choose to do different things when a network gets towards a congested state? And key success factors in this case were, as I mentioned before, aligning stakeholders, making sure people are on board, to educate the inspector as well, to explain what vision-led is about, to craft the arguments carefully, as you would do with any now King's Counsel, you know, to go through that inquiry process with those sorts of skills. To emphasize the policy compliance of the vision-led approach, but also importantly to emphasize the weight of the community and the health of that community and the carbon outcomes for that community that will arise through a vision-led approach. So that's where I want to end. So I hope that's been a useful sort of perspective on vision-led from Homes England point of view. So having said that, I will now.
Thank you very much, Jon. And I think it was a really useful overview, and also the kind of practical examples, really kind of emphasizing also what Nicola said, that nothing is stopping us. This is supported. You know, there shouldn't be barriers as such, but they are, we know that. And engagement, I think making the point about the engagement, bringing communities and councillors and members with us will be really critical. And yeah, whether the opportunity costs, and if they are clearly set out, can actually help that and help convince communities to, as you say, embrace congestion and using that towards a better kind of transport and access strategies. And actually, as I mentioned the word transport, on the chat there has been just few statements about where we need new words and new terminology and new names, because transport assessment, we are not talking transport anymore. Phil, we are talking about access, movement, and I think the language seems to be almost a bit outdated now, doesn't it? It always emphasizes the wrong thing. Actually, I was thinking kind of the other day we were talking about something similar. Should highway authorities still be called highway authorities? I mean, to be honest, we couldn't really come up with a different, everything else sounded a bit strange. But if anyone has a better name, let us know. So I think there's a whole revision of the words and the language we are using that is required to really kind of push this forward. We have got a few minutes, and there have been a number of questions, which I will just kind of throw back to the speakers. One was about if we are talking kind of, well, planning applications and really looking at the start of also the economic argument. How do business cases, where do they come in? Often they are the start to delivering and framing projects. And so do they have a greater role to play? Do they need to be kind of shifted? And then also the monitoring, that is clearly critical. So we set the vision, we do what we think we need to do, and we need to monitor whether it's successful. How do we do the monitoring, and what do we do if it's not quite working? So those stages, the long-term, I guess, adjustment and adaptation. So are there any ideas, any kind of thoughts about any examples where people have kind of followed that through, I don't know, a few years down the line and had to go back maybe to adjust something or increase the bus services, or I don't know, just picking some examples. So I think those two questions, I mean, there are lots of detailed questions as well. And I think you probably have been looking at the chat as well. But on those two, kind of one is really starting at the beginning, business cases. If any of you have got any thoughts on that, I know Homes England does do lots. I'm sure National Highways does a lot of business cases. So how does this approach feed into those early stages? And then the kind of almost the end stage, the managing, the monitoring, what's happened at that point?
I could have a go.
In on either of those?
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
I could try. Or you want to go, John?
Well, I was going to say on the topic of business cases, I think change is slow. I think it's fair to say at Homes England, you know, we still do have to meet with financial realities of sites, land values, and so on. But we are moving towards trying to appraise carbon outcomes from our developments, and you know, the carbon outcomes from transport solutions and packages will undoubtedly be part of that. But you know, at the moment, it's still, you know, I think the thing about vision-led is that we are on the cusp of a paradigm shift, you could say, of a culture change. And so when we're in that position, there won't necessarily be a lot of concrete evidence to give. It's really about, say, trying to move us to that tipping point of things being generally done differently.
Okay, thank you. David, did you want to come in on the business case point?
Only after Nicola. I know you were going in first, but it was more to remind myself of a hand.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, which I think John's reflected on it. I think that business cases are perhaps a little bit behind the curve. I'd say they're less well geared up to putting the right money in the right places, funneling the right money in the right places. We've long concentrated on kind of mega projects, and those are the things that really attract funding, tens of millions of pounds, whereas you can get really tangible, localized benefits from lots and lots of smaller schemes that cost hundreds of £1,000s or less. And our appraisal process isn't very well geared up to that. There have been recent updates to like the Green Book, which helps you with business cases, where we've started to be able to like quantify the monetary benefits of less tangible aspects of active travel. So what is kind of a monetary benefit that comes from people being more active and that sort of thing? But it's probably still not quite caught up. It's not there in a way that supports all of the right investment decisions all of the time, I would say, quite transparently. And then I do have thoughts around travel plans, but we could go to David on business cases.
Sure. Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, it's not, I guess, trying to step back and look at the reality of what we mean by business cases is there's business cases to sort of get these through, and then there's the reality of what this costs on the ground. And I think one of the big things on this is the way we're doing it now is really, really, really expensive. It's a lot of vision-led, I think, could be a big argument, and this might be something we want to think about framing-wise for not building something. It doesn't always have to be stop building this road and provide a full train network. It could sometimes just be, actually, it's fine for a little bit of congestion. It might delay your journey by like 15 seconds, and people are going to sort of, human behavior will kick in and people will start moving around differently, or that there will be no congestion. The forecast or the model is just very, very, very precisely wrong, which I think was a lovely phrase someone used earlier. So on the appraisal, I think this is a really important one, and it's not just like a beat up on traffic modelers, and it's not really an intention of this. We need to look at the kind of the appraisal tools they're having to work with as well. And because a lot of the appraisal process is based on time saving, and if you're really interested in this, I've written stuff in Computers Road on it, and there's lots of stuff online about the transport analysis guidance and the way that when you plug in a model which shows you saving sort of a minute, if you combine that by the number of people driving across that roundabout, I mean, look at Black Cat roundabout, £1.4 billion to save 9 minutes of commuting time. That's not really going to do that. It's going to be built and more people are going to drive, and therefore the congestion is going to come back over time. And actually, there's no real good evidence as to whether that 9 minutes does lead to the £9.52 of time saving benefit within that. Whereas I think looking at connectivity and access is a much more interesting metric, which can be provided by roads, can be provided by rail or other stuff, but that's more about, okay, how many more people are you now opening up access to jobs and employment and different things from? So I think the appraisal process is really important. The other thing I'd say is modelling is really expensive to do on a kind of, you know, the revenue budgets or the operational budgets of councils and developers. You know, I've seen quite a few schemes where half the design budget and half the planning budget, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds has gone into modelling, where pretty much everyone in the room said it's going to be all right, or this is a city, we expect the city as a network, you're not going to give a sort of a direct picture of what's going to happen here. You know, people will behave differently, people will move around differently. What is the vision we want? So I think it could be a real sort of cost saving. And then finally, and then I'll shut up, we kind of looking at the cost benefit. You build this great whacking great roundabout road, it gets adopted, the maintenance burden of that then gets shifted onto the local authority, and it's sort of not within the project, which is obviously very different to what can happen with a lot of local transport or light rail or bus network or wherever it might be. So there's a sort of the reality of cost benefit on the ground is not always matching up to the business case which is being put forward initially.
Yeah, thank you. Nicola?
Yeah, there was a question around how can we better monitor impacts, wasn't it? I think it's true that travel plans have, I think someone said in a comment, they've sometimes overlooked or fallen by the wayside. That's often a way in which we've monitored impacts of new development, at least. I am aware of new transport assessment guidance that the DfT is thinking about, and as part of that, the role of the travel plans is being thought about, and perhaps it actually comes into the transport assessment. So instead of having this standalone document that people put on a shelf and forget about, maybe it's a chapter of your transport assessment, your access assessment, whatever it's called. And I think it's again, I'm going to sound like I oversimplify everything, but it's easy enough to imagine how we might monitor whether a place has a good level of sustainable trips or a good mode share. In the same way that we do traffic counts at the moment, we can stick down counters that count how many people are cycling past a certain point. We can undertake travel surveys that ask people how do they travel across a certain day or a certain week. Harlow, the town of Harlow, have done that for all of their existing residents. It's something called a quality of life survey or a Harlow census. And it really helped them understand what their mode shares are at the moment, and also how they're going to work towards achieving a 40% vehicle mode share as they become Harlow and Gilston Garden Town. So I think the role of travel plans, again, us as practitioners, we can write into our transport assessments much more about how we can monitor travel behaviours. And then off the back of that, there is the question of how might we fund remedial measures in the future? Again, it's just thinking about how we already do that in the world of travel planning. We often have a bond or a fund set aside in section 106, which is for remedial measures if you don't meet travel plan targets. And it's the same sort of thing, but under a slightly different badge as we move forward.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And any last words? We have to kind of draw this to close. Amy, anything else from the...
I think just to share some really useful case studies people have flagged up today. This is going to be an ongoing thing, isn't it? There's no right or wrong answer with this, and no doubt lots more discussions to be had. But hopefully it's come across that at National Highways, we don't think we've got the answer, but we'd really like to work with others in trying to head in the right direction. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And last, I just want to highlight that and Tom Sale, he has put an alternative in that actually, rather than highway authorities, let's have a place and movement authority that covers everything: people, streets, ecology, landscape, health. I mean, that's music to my ears. And I think the UDG as well, for years we have been going on about the fragmentation, and that we are not kind of looking across different department councils. So wouldn't it be nice to bring everything under one roof, and maybe then a lot of the kind of glitches that make it difficult in day-to-day kind of life to implement these ideas and these kind of thoughts might actually disappear. But we've run over a bit. I'm sure you all potentially have other meetings to go to. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the speakers. I mean, I certainly am much clearer and actually motivated. Absolutely. Go out there, put this into place. And yeah, I'm sure this wasn't the last time that we come together. I would like to organize more events where we explain potentially difficult technical things to non-technical people and vice versa. I think Geoff had recently kind of written a nice blog about that all highway planners need to be urban designers or something like that, and all urban designers need to understand the technical side of things. So I think as a UDG, we will try and continue bringing groups together in these sessions. So thank you very much, and hopefully soon again.